Greetings, and welcome to another Enrichment with the Gifted Guy. What I'm going to be teaching you today is how to take proper notes. So you might ask yourself, why do you need to know how to take notes? And when do you need to learn to take notes? And so you can learn to take notes at any age, and it's going to be very beneficial because it helps you to capture information when someone is speaking to you, or you could be taking notes when you're reading something. So there are various ways to take notes. But oftentimes what happens is someone is speaking and you're taking notes on what they're saying and trying to capture information. And it's important to be able to have that because on average, we remember about 10% of what we hear. So if you listen to a teacher talk for 50 minutes, then you're going to remember, 5 minutes of what they said. So it's important to capture the other 40. You don't have to capture the whole entire 45 minutes, but there are going to be more important things that come up outside of that 5 minutes of focus. So taking notes is a good way to capture that information. So there are various reasons why you take notes. The first one could be, like I said, to capture information. You have all this information you want to get, and you don't want to forget anything. So if someone is giving you directions on how to go somewhere, you might want to take notes because otherwise you might misremember a street corner or a turn or whatever and get lost. If someone is trying to give you information on how to bake something and they give you all the information and you forget something, you forget to put an ingredient in, then it may mess up your cooking. And so capturing information so it can be correct is really important. The second thing is it helps keep you focused. When you're listening to someone speak, on average, you can listen about 10 minutes, really focused, even when you want to. About 10 minutes is the limit, and then your mind starts to wander, and then you start to think of other things. And by taking notes, this helps to keep you focused because you're having to really pay attention to what someone is saying because you're writing it down. And so it helps you to keep focused. It helps you to pay attention to what is being said because you're trying to capture it. And that can be very valuable. The third thing is it organizes your thoughts. So when you're taking notes, you're writing down what is relevant for you, what you think is important to remember. And so this kind of helps you to organize your own thoughts and to place them in somewhere where you can go and access them later. And this leads into our fourth purpose, which is the idea of having to study. So when you take notes, you can go back to those notes and then recall what you were hearing. Because the longer time passes, the more you forget. So if someone said something to you and 2 weeks, 3 weeks goes by, you might forget what they said, or you might forget part of what they said. So having notes to go back to refer to can help trigger your memory to help you remember what was said and remember what you were trying to capture. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give you a brief lecture, and I'm going to show you how you could capture this information in 4 different note-taking methods. And what I want you to do is, so all you have to do is pay attention. You don't have to take notes. This is going to be brief, but what I'm going to do is give you this information, and I'm going to show you how it could have been captured. So I want to talk about the shot heard around the world. The shot heard around the world is the first battle of the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is the battle between England and the colonists in the New World of America. We were not the United States of America then because we were still a colony of Britain, but we were declaring independence from them. And so this was kind of the first major battle in the American Revolution. It took place in Lexington and Concord, which is in Massachusetts. And the British military thought that because the colonists were not allowed to bear arms or to have guns, they had what was called the Quartering Act, and it was part of that. And so they heard that there was an armory being built up at these 2 towns, and so they wanted to go and see what was going on and prevent the colonists from having these weapons. And so they advanced on these 2 cities. Now, there wasn't an army back then. The United States didn't exist. There wasn't an army. What we had were called Minutemen. And Minutemen were people that could be ready at a moment's notice. They were regular people living their lives, and then if they heard something was going on, they could get their gun. They didn't have uniforms, they didn't have formal training, but they could get their guns and be ready to fight against whom they needed to. And in this case, it was the British troops, because the Minutemen armed themselves, and then to prevent the British troops from invading these towns, they fired upon them. And this took place actually before we had declared independence. We declared independence on July 4th, 1776. This took place before that, but it was part of the reason why we felt we needed to declare independence from England. And what you see in this visual is just an example of the Minutemen, at a moment's notice, getting their weapons and being ready to fight. So Old North Bridge is part of this battle. And so the Old North Bridge kind of is an actual physical bridge near Boston. But it also stands for a symbol. And the symbol is, this is where the Minutemen were able to stop the British. And this gave them a lot of confidence, because keep in mind, the British were the most powerful army in the world at this time. And so us, with our little Minutemen and their, our ragtag bunch of people, were able to stop them. It gave us confidence that we could break off from England, rather than them just taking us over. And, as a result, us being, traitors and hung for that. And so at the Old North Bridge, that we stopped the British. The Minutemen stopped the British. We had 400 men who were assembled, and there was about 100 British troops. And so we outnumbered them greatly, and we were able to turn them away. And so what you see here is a picture of the Old North Bridge, the actual Old North Bridge, and you see some reenactors dressed in British uniforms who are crossing this. But they were not able to get across it because we stopped them. And then eventually this led to the Declaration of Independence. This Declaration of Independence was a committee of 5 men were appointed, and the idea here was that they were to list the atrocities or the wrongdoings that King George had done to the colonists, such as not being able to bear arms, no taxation without representation, the having to put up troops if they came and asked to stay at your place, which was part of the Quartering Act. There was the Stamp Act. There was there were lots of taxes that were going on that we thought was very unfair. So these men listed out all of these injustices. Thomas Jefferson was one of these 5 men, and he was often credited as the main author. The Declaration of Independence is a very famous document, and we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And so he was the one who wrote those words in the entire preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We often think of that as being the Declaration of Independence, what I just said, but it's actually just the preamble, and then there was the list of things, and then there was a conclusion to that as well. The Declaration of Independence was written by these men, and then it was ratified by what we had. We didn't have Congress back then, but we had representatives on July 4th, 1776. So this was when we officially declared independence from England. And it is why we celebrate the 4th of July, because these men got together. And so you can see here's Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and others. And they wrote this Declaration of Independence, and we declared independence. So that's the lecture. So it's a lot of information to capture. And so there are various ways you could do this. I'm going to talk about 4 different methods that you could take notes. One is called the outlining, and it is the most common. It's the one most used. The sentence one is one that you would use if you're trying to capture a lot of information. So if a lot of information is being given at once, it allows you to take quick notes and to capture what you need to capture. Mapping is a method of taking notes that for visual people. And then the Cornell is one of my favorites, because not only does it give you, it allows you to capture information, it allows you to make commentary on those notes that you take. So you can make your own contributions to that, or your own comments on what was captured. So here's outlining. And again, outlining is really good for keeping people organized, because it is a very clear, structured method to taking notes. And so if we were taking what the lecture I just gave you and capturing that in an outlining format, it would look like this. So you can see I use bullet points. I have big bullet points for big items. The subheadings underneath there have indentations and smaller bullet points, and then so on and so forth. So everything that was talked about in that is captured in this on a single page. Even though it was 5-minute 3-slide presentation, they were able to capture with the outlining method all of the information that was there. Now, is there some information that is missing? Sure, you can't capture everything, but they capture the main points, which is really the important part. So if you look at that shot heard around the world, it talks about the first battle, Lexington and Concord, the reason for doing it, and then it explains the Minutemen. And so you have that information captured in this outlined format. The second method I want to talk about is called the sentence method. The sentence method is simply writing sentences. And every time you hear something, you write a sentence, then you skip a line. And then when you hear something, you write another sentence. And so you're capturing each piece of information in a single sentence. And so it looks like this. The same information we just had organized. And you can see this is not as organized as this is right here. This is a little more, you have these indentations, these bullet points that separate stuff and really make it, stand out. Here it's kind of all one big paragraph, one big lump, but it captures a lot of information. But it might be difficult when you go back to remember or to find what you're looking for because this all kind of blurs together. And so what you see there, though, it does capture all the information that was needed. And so every time something is said, you just write a line. And then when the next thing is said, you skip a line and do the next, and so on and so forth. The third method I want to talk about is what's called mapping. Mapping is for visual people. Mapping basically is you are kind of bubbling and ballooning and making connections. So it would look like this. So if we had the shot heard around the world, and I put this in a square, and then I have a square off of that that indicates it's the first battle of the American Revolution, a bubble off of that that says Lexington and Concord, a bubble off of that that says it's before America declared independence. So it captures all the information, but it shows you the connection and it organizes it visually. And so you don't see like the listing of things from the outlining and the sentence one. You see it's kind of spread out and it's mapped. And so what it does is it allows you to see everything, how it connects to one another. And then you just start another bubble when you have a new subject and another bubble when you have a new one. Okay. So that would be the mapping method. And I will say the disadvantage is that this one takes a lot of space, although, you have 1,000-page notebooks or whatever, so it's not that big of a deal. But it means that you have a lot of space to go back to review. The last one I want to talk about is called the Cornell method. And again, I like the Cornell method because it allows me, the person taking notes, to make comments as well. So this is what this looks like. You draw this line, you make columns, and on the left-hand side, you put the topics. So the shot heard around the world, Old North Bridge, Declaration of Independence. On the right side of this, then you put the information. And so I've written all the information out, whatever. But you notice these blank spots that you see in here, the spaces. And so what I could do is I could easily go into this area right here and make a comment. Something, I thought was interesting, or I thought it was something that's really important to remember. And so it gives me some space in order to be able to do that. And so I like that personally because I like to make comments on the important, why I'm taking a note and the importance of it. And so it allows me to do that. And so you could do any of these four methods. You could do a combination of these four methods. You could change methods, whatever you want. But the idea here is that you find one that really works for you. And so I'm going to talk about how do you know. So I'm going to give you some tips on note taking, and then we'll talk about how do you know the method that you're using is what's best for you. So one tip for note taking is something when you're listening to someone speak, if they repeat something several times, you should definitely write it down because it's important enough to repeat. So if you hear like Old North Bridge, Old North Bridge, Old North Bridge, that's tough to say 5 times real fast, then that's something you should write down because it's been said over and over and over. Tip number 2, listen for trigger words. These are called transitions. So if the lecturer says, this is the most significant thing, you need to write that down, or this is really important, or this was the primary effect. All these are trigger words that let you know what's coming next is going to be really important. So when you hear that, you need to be ready and poised to take a note because they're obviously saying something that's important. Because sometimes people, when they talk, are saying things that aren't important, and you don't need to take notes on everything. But hopefully they're a good enough lecturer that they let you know when something important is coming. Tip number 3 is to look for themes. So these are, so when you go back to the one we had 3 different themes. We had the Battle of Lexington and Concord, a shot heard around the world. We had the Old North Bridge, and we had the Declaration of Independence. And so those are the major themes. And so we need to capture what we need to about those themes in order for us to remember their importance. So what do we need to capture about the Declaration of Independence? What do we need to capture about the Old North Bridge? And so you look for these themes. Tip number 4, if a lecturer gives you lots of different examples, you don't have to write them all down. Just write down a few. This will help you to remember later what it was and may even trigger some that you didn't write down. But like if they give you, here are 10 reasons, blah, 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 you don't have to write down all 10 of them. Write down 3 or 4 of them, and that should be good enough to get you what you need, unless the whole lecture is about these 10 things. Like I'm doing these 10 tips. If you were taking notes on these 10 tips, you might only write down 4 of them, and that would be very helpful because you don't have to know them all. Tip number 5, when you so if I say there are 3 things that did this, that you should write those 3 things down. whenever you're given a number like that, or there are 5 reasons why this is important. You should write all 5 of them down. So when you're given a number like that in a numbered list, it's probably something that's really important. Tip number 6, if something is spelled out, this person wants you, they know that you're taking notes and they want to help you by spelling it. They obviously think it's important. So if I were talking about a Lexington, I may say, the Battle of Lexington, Lexington. If I spell that, that's a clue that is really important because the person is willing to spell it. If they didn't spell it, maybe it's not as important. Or maybe it doesn't matter that you don't spell it correctly. But if it's spelled, that's an indicator that it's something pretty important. Tip number 7, don't write every single thing down. Even using the sentence method, you don't want to write every single thing down. You want to write down what you feel is important, and you have to make that determination for yourself. And you want to put it in words that make sense to you. Notes ultimately are not for anyone else but yourself. And so you need to be able to go back to those notes and then recall information and by the information that you captured. And so it may be illegible to other people, but if you can read it, that's all that really matters. It may seem disorganized to others, but if it's organized in a way that you can follow it, then that's fine. So keep in mind, there is no right or wrong way to take notes, but how do you know whether it's effective is whether you can go back and actually recall what you need to recall. Tip number 8, if something goes on for more than 2 slides, so like I gave you a slideshow presentation, and oftentimes lectures take this format. If you see something, a theme going on for more than 2 slides, it's probably important, and you need to make sure that you capture that information. If it's something that's just mentioned just briefly, it might not be important enough to remember. It may not be important. So if I mention, oh, so-and-so had a dog named this, who cares? I mean, you don't need to capture that information. It wasn't important to knowing about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Tip number 9 is to make sure that you answer the essential question. So usually your lecturer will start with a thesis, like these are the origins of the American Revolution, might be the one for what we just talked about. So you have to make sure that you cover, like, okay, here's this battle that took place. Here's how we were able to show that we could stand up to the British, and this resulted in the Declaration of Independence. So you see the cause and effect and how these events led to the eventual American Revolution. And then tip number 10 is that look for the overall big picture. So what do you think the lecturer wants you to remember from them? So what trying to accomplish with their notes? If they're giving you notes how to get someplace, ultimately you need to know how to get to that place. And so that's what you're trying to do. And so it doesn't matter how you capture it, as long as you capture how to get to that place, that's all that really matters. So these are 10 tips you might want to consider when taking notes. So I'm going to conclude with some final thoughts to think about. First off, organization is really important. You need to be able to go back and find things easily. If you have just like a paragraph of information, it's going to be hard to pick out specific phrases, words, and things of that nature. So organizing your notes are going to be really important, but organize it so that it makes sense to you. So you might underline something or star something or highlight something. This helps you to know that that was really important. So you need to go back to that. Readability is also a factor. And what I mean by readability is that you need to be able to read your own handwriting. There are times I've taken notes and I go back and I can't even tell what I wrote. That's a problem because then I can't go back and recall what it is I was trying to remember because I can't read it. So keep in mind, it only has to be readable for you. So I have really bad handwriting, but if I take notes, I have to write well enough that I can read it later so it doesn't all blur together. Doesn't mean I have to write pristine, handwriting. It just means I need to be able to read it. And lastly is you have to ask yourself, did you capture the content that you intended to? The content you think was important. So when you go to take that test in the American Revolution and you're asked questions about it, did you take notes that came up on the test? If you didn't, then it means maybe you're not capturing the important things. But if you did capture that in your notes, and then it means that you're taking good notes because you're capturing the main ideas, the themes, the essential questions. So what you can do to evaluate I use this with my students. I have a note-taking rubric where I take a look at the 3 things I just talked about, which are organization, readability, and content. And so it shows if you're doing an excellent job, then the notes are easy to follow. The student uses headings so that the topic shifts are easy to see, and that the notes are in order and complete. That would be an excellent. If your notes are difficult to follow, if they do not use headings, so it's hard to tell when things shift, and they're completely out of order, they don't follow a logical order, and so it's hard to follow, then those need improvement. And so you could use a rubric like this to evaluate your own notes to see whether what you're doing is effective or not. So the process of learning notes is to experiment. So try these different methods. I've given you 4 different methods. So try them all, or try one of them. If it, like, figure out the one that works for you. There is no one way to do anything, and there's no one way to take notes. There's ones that people prefer. I prefer the Cornell method because it allows me to make commentary. Other people might prefer the mapping because they're artists and they like to draw. So find the one that works best for you, and then trial and error when you're taking notes. Like, try abbreviations, try shortening things, try indicating things that are important with different symbols or whatever. So you'll be learning how to take notes the rest of your life. Just because you learn once doesn't mean you know how to do it. You'll evolve, you'll get better at it. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And you'll start to get like a shorthand in what you can read those notes, and even though it doesn't make sense to anyone else, because you know what you're saying. You should reflect, always reflect. When you take notes, were you able to use them effectively? And if you weren't, then something has to change. You can't, if you take notes and you don't capture what you need to capture, then those notes were not effective. So you should try something else. And then lastly is being adaptable. And so you might have to change the method that you use to take notes depending upon what's being said. So if someone was talking at you for an hour, you might use the sentence because you have to capture a lot of information. If they're just talking for you for 10 minutes, then you might use the bullet points or the outlining so that you just capture the main ideas. And so sometimes you have to let the note-taking method fit the type of lecture, the type of information that you're getting. If you are reading a book and taking notes, you might want to try the Cornell method, because the Cornell method allows you to make if you're talking about a character, you can comment on what you thought on that character. So be adaptable. Don't get fixed into something and just stubborn and stay on that. Use these tools to the best of their ability. So I do want to remind you that if you want to learn some more, I have Enrichment with the Gifted Guy videos on my website. They can be found at thegiftedguy.com/enrichment. And so I have things like skills like I taught you today. I have learning how to play certain games, how to do how-to ones, and all sorts of ones for students to use. So I hope you enjoyed our session today, and I look forward to seeing how your notes turn out.